The 1990s were coming to a close, and Wizards of the Coast were preparing to take Dungeons & Dragons into the 21st century. In August of the year 2000, Wizards of the Coast released Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition. The first book to be released was the Player's Handbook, which came out in August of 2000. The Dungeon Master's Guide came out in September of that year, and the Monster Manual came out in October. So the three core books were released over the course of 3 consecutive months. 3rd edition was an edition that was filled with changes, and one of the first changes could be seen without even opening any of the books. Wizards of the Coast decided to drop the word advanced from their titles, so they simply labeled it Dungeons & Dragons. The reason for this is actually pretty simple. The basic edition that people had been playing for years had been out of print for several years at this point. I think the last printing of it was in 1991, I want to say. So it had been probably about 9 years since they last printed any sort of basic version of the game. So without the basic version, there can't be any advanced version. There's only one version of D&D, and that's what they called it. Just simple, straightforward Dungeons & Dragons. 3rd edition changed more than just the title, however. It represented a major overhaul of the rules, and essentially what Wizards did was they redesigned the whole game from the ground up. Amongst the changes was the elimination of class and race restrictions. So no longer did you have dwarf fighters that were capped at like 9th level, for example. You could play any race, any class, and progress all the way through up to 20th level. Now, in addition to changing those restrictions, they also eliminated the different progressions for each class with experience points. So now all classes leveled up at the same rate, meaning that each character, regardless of what class they were playing, earned 2nd level once they reached 1,000 experience points. Unlike in previous editions where fighters might reach it at 1,000, but a mage might not reach it until 1,250 experience points. So that was eliminated. Everyone progressed at the same rate. The combat system was also completely redone. Armor class still began at a base of 10, however, rather than lowering it, armor now raised your AC. THAC0 was effectively replaced by a base attack bonus that similarly counted up. Saving throws were also changed. Rather than having the 5 saving throw types of paralyzation, poison or death magic, rod, staff or wand, petrification or polymorph, breath attacks or spells, the saving throw types were now reduced to 3, being fortitude, which you can use to save against effects that attack the physical body, similar to poison, petrification, things of that nature. Reflex saves, which represent your ability to react and to seek cover or defend yourself against spells like Fireball, and will saves that protect you against things that target the minds, like charm spells. There are many other changes to discuss, but before we do that, I want to discuss the core rulebooks themselves. So the first book to be released was the Player's Handbook. And similar to its previous edition counterparts, Player's Handbook has everything that the player needs to create and play their character. It also contains the comprehensive combat system as well, similar to how 2nd edition did. Now, as far as the races go, in 3rd edition, the races included were the human, the dwarf, the elf, the gnome, the half-elf, the halfling, and half-orcs actually made their return after being exiled from the 2nd edition version of the game. Similar to the return of the half-orc, the monk actually made their return as well, so that was one of the classes that one could play. So monk finally made a return after again being absent from 2nd edition. The rest of the classes included were the bard, the cleric, druid, the fighter, the paladin, the ranger, the rogue, and the wizard. 3rd edition would also introduce us to 2 brand new classes, being the barbarian and the sorcerer. So the barbarian was a martial character, so it was a warrior type, that was able to fly into a fit of rage. When they did this, they gained a bonus to their strength and their constitution, so they were able to hit better, hit harder, and they were tougher to take down while they were raging. Now, once the rage ended, their scores dropped back to normal, So you had to be careful about how much damage you had taken before your rage ends, because once the Constitution drops back down, there was a chance that the barbarian could put themselves in a situation where they would fall unconscious and start bleeding out. In addition to the barbarian, the sorcerer was also introduced in 3rd edition, and this class was an arcane class that drew its spell list from the same list as the wizards did. However, they didn't have to prepare their spells ahead of time, so the sorcerer had a certain number of spells that they knew, and they could cast them in any combination that they wanted to. Now, they were still limited by how many spells of each level they could cast, so there was only so many first level spell slots that they had, only so many second level spell slots, and so on, but they still didn't have to prepare their spells ahead of time, so it made them a little bit more flexible as far as that goes. The Player's Handbook also introduced us to a new skill system. Now, this is a major addition to the game from even its 2nd edition counterpart, which did have non-weapon proficiencies, but they were actually an optional rule, and they weren't necessarily factored into the game. With 3rd edition, the skill system was an integral part for everything that happened in every adventure that you played. So it was a major, major part of the game, and it was a welcome addition for a lot of fans. Each class for the skills would receive a certain number of skill points as they leveled up. So every time they leveled, they would get some more skill points. Skill points could then be used to purchase ranks in a skill. Each rank was equal to a +1 bonus when using the skill. Each class had a list of skills that they considered to be class skills, which, if you look on the chart here, are represented as the larger circles. Whenever spending a skill point on a class skill, 1 point was equal to 1 rank. You could also purchase skills outside of your class list. These were referred to as cross-class skills. As you look here, they are represented by the smaller dots. To purchase a rank in a cross-class skill, you had to spend 2 skill points. There were a few skills as well that the class was prohibited from taking. If you look here, there's a few X's on the column. And what that meant is that the class simply was never able to use that particular skill. For example, a barbarian could not take ranks in Decipher Script skill since they were illiterate. There was a limit to the number of ranks one could have in a skill. The maximum number of ranks for a class skill was your level +3, so a first level character could have a maximum of 4 ranks in a class skill. Cross-class maximum ranks were half of what the maximum were for class skills, so the same first level character could have a maximum of 2 ranks in their cross-class skills. Now, in addition to the skill system, 3rd edition also saw a new version of multi-classing. So before, in previous editions, you had to decide what you were going to multi-class as at first level, and you were locked into that through the entirety of your progression. In 3rd edition, characters no longer had to decide what they would multi-class as at the very beginning. Once they earned 1,000 experience points, they could either enter 2nd level of their original class, or they could take 1st level in a 2nd class. So, for example, let's say you made a human fighter, and upon reaching 1,000 experience points, you decide rather than taking 2nd level of fighter, so instead of taking the 2nd level, you decide that you're going to take 1st level as a cleric. So what you would do is you would gain all the benefits of a 1st level cleric in this example, or a 1st level of whatever 2nd class that you're looking to add. So you would gain the hit dice, you would gain the base attack bonus, as well as their saving throw bonuses. You do not gain the maximum hit dice for being 1st level, you only get that for 1st level at the very beginning of whichever class you initially choose. So if you become 1st level cleric, you still have to roll your d8 hit dice. You do add their base attack bonus. In this case, the base attack bonus is still 0, so you wouldn't actually change anything there. However, you would add their saving throw bonuses of +2 to fortitude saves and +2 to will saves. You'd also gain the ability to turn a rebuke undead, as well as the spells that you would gain for a 1st level cleric. Even though you are a 1st level fighter and a 1st level cleric, your character is going to be 2nd level overall, because if you recall, everybody progresses at the same rate. So you still earned 1,000 experience points, you still have 2 class levels that you have, and 2 full hit dice instead of having the half hit dice that you used to have in the previous versions of the game. Now, upon reaching 3,000 experience points, you now have a choice. You could take second level in either of those classes, or you could take first level in a third class, and so on. Now, one thing to keep in mind when multi-classing is you don't want the levels to get too far apart. So if you have a gap of more than 2 levels between any two classes that you have, you would suffer a 20% experience to all, or 20% penalty to all experience until that gap is closed. So for example, if you have a 4th level fighter and a 3rd level cleric, you gain your experience normally. So that if you were a 4th and then 3rd, there's only a gap of 1, that's fine. However, if you decide to become a 5th level fighter and a 3rd level cleric, so you decide to level up fighter again before leveling up your cleric class, you would then have that 20% penalty, and that applies until you close that gap and bring them to within 1 level of each other. Now, let's just say, using this earlier example, because it can get worse if you decide to multi-class into more than 2 classes. So let's use the previous example of having a 5th level fighter, a 3rd level cleric, and then let's just say you decide to pick up 1st level of rogue. You would actually now be at a 40% penalty because you have all 3 classes with more than a gap of 2 between each individual one. This would be done, this is done mainly to prevent people from abusing the system. Each race, now to combat this, each race has a favorite class. So a favorite class doesn't count towards the penalty when you're determining what you have for a experience with multi-class characters. So if you're a dwarf fighter, for example, or if you're a dwarf, sorry, I should say, fighter levels don't count. So if you were a 5th level fighter as a dwarf and a 3rd level cleric, you wouldn't have the experience penalty. So, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the biggest change to 3rd edition. I've sort of alluded to it already, but now it's time to discuss it in full, and that is actually the creation of the D20 system. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, like 1st and 2nd edition, both used different systems for determine the success or failure of different things, which this often led to confusion about when you wanted to roll either above a certain number or below a certain number. With new players in particular, this could often be difficult because they didn't know when they were making a particular dice roll if it was good to roll bad or low. When I was running my 2nd edition games, the most common question that I've ever had asked was, do I want to roll high or low on this one? Oftentimes, simply asking the question could lead to second guessing. The D20 system created one core mechanic that was streamlined, consistent, and more importantly, easy to learn, and it was easy to teach. The D20 system is simple. You roll a 20-sided dice, you add bonuses, you subtract penalties, and attempt to equal or exceed a target number. This mechanic determined everything in the game with the exception of hit points and damage rolls. So initiative, attack rolls, saving throws, skill checks, ability checks, all of these things were determined by rolling the 20-sided dice, adding bonuses, subtracting penalties, looking to equal or exceed a target number. The creation of the D20 system really opened the door for new players who would often get confused with the earlier versions of the game and the earlier rules. And a lot of times with the previous editions, some new players would tend to get frustrated and eventually give up on it. This more user-friendly edition was able to revitalize the tabletop RPG industry by accomplishing what TSR had tried and failed to do with 2nd edition, and that was to bring in a brand new consumer base. So the D20 system was something that was huge. In addition to the way that the D20 system worked, ability scores were also changed quite a bit. In the previous editions of the game, each ability score had its own separate chart for what it provided. With this version of the game, it was simple, it was straightforward, and it was just a matter of pluses and minuses depending on your ability scores. So, for example, a 10 gets you a +0 bonus, so it's not a bonus or a penalty. Every even number after that got you an increasing bonus of +1, up to like a score of 18, for example, for a 1st level character, would give them a modifier of +4. Penalties also similarly applied and worked under the same principle. So what they would do for every 2 below the 10, you would get an extra penalty associated with everything. So the D20 system, again, it was a great big change to the game, and for somebody who liked to teach new players, It was a huge sigh of relief when I finally got my player's handbook. It was something that was so intuitive and so simple that I don't think anybody could really get frustrated with at least the core mechanics of the game. But anyway, that's the player's handbook. The things that were in that. Now what I'd like to do is discuss some of the other core books. So the next one we're going to talk about is going to be the DMG. Released in September 2000, the Dungeon Master's Guide contained everything a DM needed to design and run a campaign, which is pretty standard for DMGs from all the previous editions. However, the DMG for 3rd edition did include a new feature, and that was the idea of prestige classes. Prestige class was a system where players could specialize in certain areas, but they had to qualify essentially to take levels in these classes. To qualify for them, they would often have to have a certain number of ranks in specific skills. They'd have to have certain feats. Some of them required a certain level of spellcasting. There were some base attack bonuses. Some, I think, even may have had saving throw bonuses that they had to have at a certain point. And some of these prestige classes eventually could have things like race restrictions. So let's just use the Arcane Archer, for example. The Arcane Archer's requirements are as follows. So this actually has one of the racial ones. You must be an elf or a half-elf. Base attack bonus must be +6 or greater. For feats, the character must have weapon focus with either a longbow or a short bow. They have to have point-blank shot and precise shot, as well as the ability to cast first-level arcane spells. So this one, for example, works best if you kind of multi-class a fighter-type class with a level of sorcerer or wizard. With the requirements met, the player can choose to enter the prestige class. Prestige classes do not follow the normal rules for multi-classing when it comes to experience penalties, so you're not going to suffer a penalty to your experience because you work towards becoming one of these prestige classes, like the Arcane Archer in this example. By doing so, however, by entering the class, you do gain unique abilities that none of the other classes would normally get. So the Arcane Archer, using this example, gains the ability to enchant arrows with increasing bonuses to attack and damage as they progress through their levels. In addition, they can imbue an arrow with an area of effect spell, similar to like a fireball or a burning hands. They can fire an arrow that seeks its target, ignoring cover and concealment. They can fire a hail of arrows, with one arrow for each level of Arcane Archer that they have. And at its maximum level, they can create an arrow that can actually outright slay its target if they fail a fortitude save. In addition to the Arcane Archer, other prestige classes include the Assassin, which is pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. The Blackguard, which is an evil fighter type that actually can gain unique abilities if you started as a Paladin, fall from Paladinhood, and exchange Paladin levels for Blackguard levels, for example. There's a lot that you can... a lot of interesting things that you can do there. There's the Dwarven Defender, which can enter a defensive stance that grants them a bonus to their strength score, their constitution score, armor class, and saving throws. There's the Lore Master that can unlock mystical magical secrets. Things like one of the ones they have here is Instant Mastery, where they can gain 4 ranks in a skill which they had no ranks before. There's Newfound Arcana, where they gain a bonus spell. There's things like Secret Health, where they gain extra hit points. So that's basically what the Lore Master does, and they work best again as an arcane caster. I believe they actually have to have the ability to, well, they don't have to be necessarily an arcane caster. They just have the ability to cast a certain number of divination spells. There's also, finally, there's the Shadow Dancer, which can basically teleport by jumping from shadow to shadow. So they can enter one shadow and exit out of another, which is kind of interesting. And again, these are class features that no other class in the player's handbook would even have anything similar to at all. Now that was one of the big changes to 3rd edition, the DMG, but there's another major one as well, which takes the form of magic items. So magic items in 3rd edition, particularly with armor and weapons, allow you to customize them in ways that you couldn't in previous versions. So the way that this essentially works is you have a total bonus available of up to +10 for armors, shields, and weapons. Now only 5 of this magical modifier can be given towards bonuses to either the armor class or the attack rolls and damage rolls of a weapon, for example. However, everything above that can be used to add unique abilities that have virtual modifiers. So, for example, let's just take a weapon here. So we have a weapon that it can't have more than a +5 to attack and damage, but we do have another 5 levels worth of enchantment that we can put on there using different abilities. So we look at the abilities here. As you can see, they each have their own sort of virtual modifiers. So for example, you can add the flaming ability to a weapon, which is a virtual bonus of +1. It has to be magical before you do that, and this virtual bonus does not apply to the attack rolls or the damage rolls for the weapon. It simply kind of works towards determining how many things you can have on a magical weapon. Also, making their return into 3rd edition would be artifacts. So something that was missing from the 2nd edition DMG. Artifacts make their return. Things like the Book of Vile Darkness, Deck of Many Things, Sphere of Annihilation, and of course things like the Hand and Eye of Vecna. So they made their return to 3rd edition, the DMG, as well. So that's basically what the Dungeon Master's Guide is like. So we talked about the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide. All that's left is to discuss the Monster Manual. Alright, so the Monster Manual is the most straightforward of the 3 books. This was released in October of 2000. And it's essentially all that it is it's a collection of monsters. So it's just simple and straightforward. And you would think that this is all that would be included. However, even the 3rd edition Monster Manual had changes to it. So if you look at past versions of the game, you had things like powerful undead or lycanthropes, which were basically simply monsters, even though their flavor text in like the 2nd edition Monsters Manual did allude to them being, could be other things like a lich, for example, being a powerful wizard that sought eternal existence through undeath. In 3rd edition, what they include are templates. Now, templates are things that you add on to existing NPCs or even player characters, although it's not recommended that you do it with player characters. But they allow you to customize these types of monsters. So let's just say you wanted to create your own lich from scratch. You would create a wizard first, to whatever level that you wanted to do it to, and then you apply the lich template, which provides them with certain bonuses. It can change their hit dice sometimes, and can grant them special attacks. So for example, the lich, for every hit dice that you have, you go from, so the wizard, for example, would go from a d4 up to a d12. Their speed stays the same, but they get a +5 natural bonus to their armor class. They get some natural attacks that they can use, as well as some special abilities like Fear Aura, Paralyzing Touch, and other things as well, like damage reduction, things of that nature. Some of them they also gain bonuses to ability scores and things like that. So the ability to do this was actually pretty cool. It was a nice level of customization that just really wasn't in the previous versions of the game. So it was nice to see that. Now, in addition to allowing those templates into the game, Wizards of the Coast, where they were bringing things back from previous editions, actually brought back demons and devils. So we have the demons here. They still referred to them as Tanari, but they were under the heading of demon, which was nice, so they finally brought those back. And they did the same thing for devils. So they were still, once again, referred to them as Badazu, but they had the devil and demon headers. So they brought back a lot of the things that were kind of missing from 2nd edition, which it was nice to see. And again, the addition of the monster templates was pretty cool as well. It just adds new levels to your adventure design as a dungeon master. So those are basically the 3 core books and kind of what you can find in them. So now that we've discussed that, let's talk about some of the positive things that definitely came with 3rd edition. So one of the things that Wizards of the Coast really nailed with 3rd edition was simply the production values. I mean, the books were absolutely gorgeous looking. Nice details on the covers, the front covers, even the spines had nice design to them. everything looked really great. The pages, the paper was a nicer quality than what they had in the second edition ones. You know, a little thicker, more of a glossy type of paper. And it also had this nice full-colored border that went around each of the pages, which wasn't something that they really needed to do, but it was, again, just kind of a nice little design feature that really made the books look really, you know, well designed and well thought out. Another thing that I really liked about the third edition books was the fact that they had a sense of cohesion with their iconic characters. So these were people like Jozan. They were the characters, or iconic characters for each of the classes. So Jozan was the cleric, and we had, you know, like Tordak and Regdar for fighters. We had, where is she here? We had Lita for the rogue, and even Miley, or I believe it's Miley, Mailey, whatever her name is, as the wizard. So these characters would basically become sort of iconic to third edition, and they would be used throughout the books. Like some of the various artworks would use these iconic characters. So it just sort of created this sense of cohesiveness throughout the entire edition, really. And it was just sort of nice to see. It felt like a lot of care and attention went into this. In addition to having these iconic characters, they did also release, with the book, they had a core pantheon of gods, which were not existent in any of the previous editions of the game. Now, there were definitely supplements that included gods, but the core books didn't have any of that. So each of the gods, of course, would bestow unique abilities upon clerics that worship them. And it was just nice to see. Again, it was just another level of depth in the core books that DMs or players alike could do an awful lot with. And these gods were actually, I believe, pulled out of the Greyhawk setting, which was sort of the default setting for the third edition game. But again, it was just another nice feature to have something like that in there. Another nice thing about the books was the price. So if you take a look here, the US price for the first run of third edition books was $19.95, with the Canadian prices varying from $21.95 or $27.95 to $31.95, depending. I think the Player's Handbook was a little bit more expensive in Canada, just because it was thicker pages than the other two, which ran for the $27.95. But this low price made buying into third edition easy for younger gamers, and was one of the things that could help establish that young, new, fresh consumer base. Another great creation with third edition was the OGL, or the Open Gaming License. The Open Gaming License was a guideline that allowed third-party publishers to create their own products using the D20 system. So this meant that publishers did not need to create their own unique systems in order to start publishing material. They could use the rules from Dungeons & Dragons to release their own products. So the OGL created a boom for the industry, as new companies would capitalize on the success of Dungeons & Dragons to kind of get their foot in the door. So companies like Sword and Sorcery and AEG would capitalize quite a bit and benefit quite a bit under the Open Gaming License. Swords and Sorcery would actually eventually obtain licenses to produce the Ravenloft setting for 3rd edition, as well as the Gamma World setting for Wizards of the Coast, having the official seal of approval from Wizards of the Coast on each of those products. In addition to the success of D&D, Wizards of the Coast would also release the Chainmail Miniatures game in October of 2000. So, what we've got here is the Chainmail game. It was a skirmish level miniatures game, tabletop miniatures game, which actually had a really detailed, nicely detailed backstory that brought, again, character to each of the factions. The basic premise was the war god Stratus was slain, and with his final words he cursed the world to be forever at war until somebody can ascend to take his place. The factions included were Thalos, which was a human army that specialized in naval battles. There was the fiendish army Naresh, which comprised of gnolls and demons. Drazen's horde consisted of orcs, goblinoids, and ogres, as well as beasts like owlbears and other wild animals. Amut's legion was made up of evil humanoids and undead. Mordengard was the dwarven faction that specialized in high armor but slow movement. And my personal favorite was the elven faction of Revilla, which specialized in ranged combat, but also had a few, ground troops as well to keep the archers safe. The last faction that would be introduced towards the end of its game or life cycle was the Drow faction of Killsec. Now, though they were released later in Chainmail's, but they were released later in Chainmail's lifespan. Chainmail used metal miniatures, which you would have to put together and paint, and each faction would see a new unit released every month with a new set coming out every 4 months. Now, each set would introduce new abilities, rules, and update the story to introduce the new units that would be included. Now, it seems as if, looking at all this, that everything was coming up roses for Wizards of the Coast at this time. They released a slew of supplements for 3rd edition. Their Chainmail game was getting steady releases, so, on the surface, everything seemed absolutely fantastic. Now, unfortunately, with this new version of Dungeons & Dragons, it actually only lasted for 3 years. So, what exactly went wrong? So Wizards of the Coast did see huge success with their initial run of books. However, as the years started to progress, some of the cracks in the foundation of 3rd edition would begin to show. The design team for 3rd edition, to the best of their credit, attempted to make the most comprehensive rule set that they could, trying to create rules for basically every scenario. Everything that they could think of had some sort of mechanic or rule for it. The problem is that sometimes the wording for these rules weren't as clear, perhaps, as they should have been. They were sometimes open to interpretation enough that it would lead to arguments between players and DMs as to how the rules should really work. This started to sort of build a confrontational atmosphere between players and dungeon masters. In some of the earlier games that I even played in myself, it felt like, there were times it felt like the DM was out to get us. It was just basically out to punish us. And at the same time, there were scenarios where it felt like some of the fellow players were simply trying to abuse the rules and mess with or screw with the Dungeon Master. 3rd edition, I think, was the first version of the game to create what's referred to as rules lawyers, which I don't think were as big a part of things like 2nd or especially like 1st edition AD&D, which was really about the DM having the ability to rule however they feel is fair. Rules lawyers were basically people who would reinterpret the rules in a way that favored them, but would use the exact wording as a way to sort of back them up. And as somebody who, was playing through this era, it was not fun. I did not enjoy sitting through and listening to some of these arguments. As a DM, I was actually there for an argument which lasted for almost an hour between 2 different players. Because they were trying to argue over who should get the first attack of opportunity against one another because they both wanted to grapple each other and throw the other down this pit trap. That scenario led me to take a year-long break from running anything. I would continue to be a player, but I just gave up entirely on DMing for quite a while until I finally kind of got that urge to jump back in. Now, some of the design of things like spells, some of the way that some of the spells interacted with one another weren't really foreseen to be the way that they ended up being. Some spells were just plainly overpowered, or what we sometimes refer to in our group as broken. An example for that could be the spell Creeping Doom, which is an area spell that you basically create this zone with 1,000 tiny insects that will bite or they'll sting whatever's in their area. They'll deal 1 point of damage before they die. The problem with that is that it's simply dropping 1,000 points of damage on a specific area, which led to me, again, completely abandoning a campaign. I spent over an hour designing this encounter with some NPCs. I kind of went into detail on their backgrounds, and I really enjoyed creating their equipment, leveling them all up from, I think this was a 15th or 16th level adventure, so progressing them through all the different levels, and it was a really enjoyable encounter for me to design, but it was ended in 2 rounds because of the spell. Like, they just basically, here's 1,000 points of damage, and everybody died, and that just again led to me losing any desire to continue running, and I stopped running again for probably a few months. So that was one of the big issues, and there were just combinations of things that they just really didn't take into account. Something simple like how a haste spell would allow a wizard to cast multiple spells. Not such a big deal at the lower levels when they would burn through all of their spells pretty quickly. But at higher levels, they have a lot more options, and having a high-level wizard cast 2 Horde Wiltings in the same round as a Quickened Fireball, that's a lot of damage that can be done. There are ways around these types of things. There were things that the DMs could come up with to counteract these combinations, but again, that went towards fostering that confrontational environment that I felt really existed with 3rd edition. Some of the classes were also pretty underwhelming. The one that I look at the most as just being not that greatly designed and not that fun to play, even though it's my favorite type of character class, was the Ranger. So you've got the Ranger here. This is all that they get. Right? Their abilities are not so great. They have the ability to wear medium armors, but if they do that, they lose their main class feature, which is the ability to fight with 2 weapons. So, why would you give them proficiency in an armor that they lose their abilities in if they actually wear? Just, things like that just weren't really done as well as they could have been. The reliance on creating these custom magic armors and weapons also really led to players designing their characters not around what they want to take for, like feats or what skills they want to have or what class features they gain as they level up, but they really started designing their characters around what magic items that they wanted and what combinations of things they could add to a magic weapon or armor to get the most out of it. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of combination of spells that just kind of broke things. And again, the wording of certain things just really wasn't where it should have been. One of the more infamous things I had mentioned earlier was attacks of opportunity. An attack of opportunity is something where you basically perform an action that leaves you open to getting basically an attack against you. So if you move away from somebody that's right there attacking you, then that leaves you open. You can draw an attack of opportunity. So there were so many things that could draw an attack of opportunity, and there were so many things that could counteract the things that drew attacks of opportunity, that it became really confusing to know what caused them and what didn't. So you would do what most players or DMs would do, and you would consult the charts. So you look here, there's a lot of, yes or no, which is pretty good to have, pretty handy. But then you get over to another column here, and attacks of opportunity granted, usually, maybe, usually, and I think some of the charts even have things like sometimes, or, if you look at the first one here, look how many maybes there are, which defeats the whole purpose of having a chart in the first place. The game designers did sort of admit or allude to the fact that they didn't really playtest for 3rd edition as thoroughly as they could have, and they didn't foresee a lot of the combination of things that would occur. Now, another issue that 3rd edition was faced with was some lackluster supplements. There were some that just really weren't well conceived or didn't really function well in regards to what they think. I think they thought they were attempting to accomplish. So the one I want to talk about in particular, I don't own it because to me it was kind of that bad. But it's the Psionics Handbook for 3rd edition. If any of you out there have it, the Psionics Handbook was something I was actually looking really forward to. I borrowed it from a friend because I didn't have the money to pick it up at the time, and I'm glad I did because I would never spend money on that book. The way that Psionics worked essentially is it required your character to have multiple high scores, because the things that your ability score that you use to determine how difficult it was to save against your psionic attacks would be different depending on which psionic focus you took, but it would also again be different than the ability score that you would use to determine how many bonus power points you had, as well as some other features. So it now meant that instead of having to have one really good score, like a wizard had to have intelligence, a cleric had to have wisdom, you now had to have something like maybe a high constitution to determine what your saves are for your psionic class, as well as like a high charisma or something like that to determine how many bonus power points that you get. Another thing that was really not well thought out with the Psionics book in particular was the fact that their powers didn't scale up as they leveled up. So things like Wizard's Fireball, for example, does 1d6 per level of the spellcaster, up to a maximum of 10d6, which is pretty classic. But a psionic character, their first level ability that they cast, their first level power, will always do the same amount of damage, which is kind of underwhelming when you look at, how many powers you actually are able to know. I believe you had the option to switch out lower level powers for higher level ones, but it would have been nice to have something where they kind of scaled to make them still useful as you progressed. Other supplements were kind of interesting or novel concepts, but I don't think they really played out that well or ever really saw a lot of practical use. And for that, well, I do have one of those. Bring your attention to the Stronghold Builder's Guidebook. So has everything that you might need if you want to create like a stronghold or a keep for your higher level characters. But I just found that in our groups, it was never used. I'm not saying that the book never saw any use anywhere, but I think it's one of those things that was more of a novelty, just a sort of a read that was interesting, but I don't think it's something that players ever really sat down with and said, okay, we need to design this fortress. Sorry, I don't think it ever really got as much use as it probably should have. A lot of supplements for 3rd edition were also black and white. So when we talked about the quality of the players' books, like the core books, Player's Handbook, DMG, and Monster Manual, a lot of the supplements actually just kind of had this black and white look to it. Which, again, the prices weren't terrible, but this one here, like this cost more than the core books did. It was $21.95 for the US price to buy this, where it was only $19.95 to buy the Player's Handbook. So this soft cover black and white book cost more than the core books. So there was just things like that I think kind of worked against 3rd edition. And not only was things kind of spiraling a little bit out of control for 3rd edition, but chainmail itself would also fall victim during this time. So in 2001, I believe, chainmail, I think it was October 2001, chainmail was released. They did release 3 full sets for each of the factions with 3 models each. When they got to set 4, which was a little over a year, I think, after it was released, they announced its cancellation. So set 4 only actually saw a couple models get released per faction. And it was a shame because I believe Chainmail actually won some Miniature Game of the Year awards right before, within a few days of them announcing its cancellation. Chainmail was a product that, I really enjoyed. The group that I played with or gamed with really enjoyed. It just wasn't marketed. Like Wizards of the Coast just did not market this product. They didn't really seem to really get behind it. And I think part of that was they realized the potential of the collectible miniatures game market, which was being led by games like Mage Knight, where they could produce cheap, plastic, pre-painted, and randomized miniatures for less than it would cost to produce something like this. So Chainmail ended up getting canceled a little over a year into its life, and again in the year 2002, Wizards of the Coast actually revised their Star Wars role-playing game, which used the D20 system. And people, when they saw they revised the Star Wars system, because it had a lot of similarities to 3rd edition, the fact that they decided to revise that led a lot of people to believe that 3rd edition similarly was going to get revised. Wizards of the Coast was kind of quiet about this. I don't think they ever outright denied it or tried to say it wasn't, a possibility, but I don't think they really overly acknowledged it until they finally did announce that 3rd edition was going to receive a revision. So that's where we're going to end things off for this week. Next week we're going to talk about that revision. We're going to talk about when 3rd edition ends up getting an upgrade. So we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons version 3.5. So be sure to check that out next week. Thank you for watching, YouTube.